And it's my delight to welcome you to this virtual international symposium on Bosnia 25 years after the Dayton Accords. I'd like to begin simply with an acknowledgement that Yale University and the Genocide Studies program acknowledge that indigenous peoples and nations, including the Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Niantic and Quinnipiac, as well as other Algonquin-speaking peoples, have stewarded throughout the generations the lands and waterways of what is now Connecticut, and that we honor, respect, and the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. In an international virtual symposium, it's still important to be mindful that we sit and use the resources in this geographic locality as well. I'd like to now introduce the co-host of this conference, David Pettigrew from Southern Connecticut State University. We'll hear more from him tomorrow, and we can introduce his full academic background and his expertise then. But it is, let me just say for now that it's been a real pleasure to organize this with David. His experience and dedication to the Balkans and to Bosnia in particular is unparalleled in New Haven, at least. Shared, I think, paralleled perhaps with many who are also attending and participating in this conference. But I find it always to be an inspiration, and it's been inspiring to work with him. With that, I will turn it over to David to introduce our next introduction. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, David. Good morning and welcome to all. And thanks to the Yale Macmillan Center and Genocide Studies Program for supporting our symposium, Bosnia 25 years after the Dayton Accords. And to David Simon for collaborating with Southern Connecticut State University. It's my pleasure this morning to get things started and introduce Dr. Robert S. Present, who is our Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Southern Connecticut State University, who will formally open the symposium. This also gives me the opportunity to thank our Provost for his support, and also to thank our Judaic Studies program at SCSU for its support of our symposium. Welcome, Provost Present.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everyone. And on behalf of Southern Connecticut State University, a school we believe is a leader in issues of social justice, I am pleased to join all of you at this really important conference. And I'm especially pleased that Dr. Pettigrew from our philosophy department here at Southern has been able to partner with colleagues in the Genocide Studies program at Yale University, especially Dr. David Simon, the director of the program. These two led the way in bringing this important conference together. I also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge and welcome the many distinguished colleagues joining this conference, with a special thanks to Valentin Inzko, High Representative Bosnia and Herzegovina, and our keynote speaker, Haris Halilovic, scholar from RMIT University, Melbourne. There is so much complexity that led up to the Dayton Accords, starting with the dissolution of the Yugoslav Federation and leading to the deaths of tens of thousands of people. The Dayton Accords were declared a peace agreement by the presidents of Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia, and created the General Framework Agreement for Peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But this peace agreement has had so much tragedy preceding it and so much history in the last 25 years that it's this that will bring so much substance to this conference. For me, not being an historian nor a political scientist, the complexities of this region and the history of this region is truly overwhelming. During the war, we saw over 100,000 killed, over 1 million people displaced, war atrocities, genocide, growing political and religious factions, redundant ceasefires and breaches of those ceasefires, and a relatively slow response of the international community. The response rate of the United Nations to bring NATO into the fray remains much debated. The geographic solutions remain contentious. The actual accords themselves remain contentious points. The ideas of reparations, reconciliation, genocide or ethnic cleansing issues, the results of the regional diaspora, and the impact, good and bad, of the accords all remain points of friction and ongoing debate. And these are just some of the issues that will be addressed in this conference, and addressed with hopes that, once again, that clarity of the past and understanding of our present will better shed light on paths to be taken to ensure our collective global future. And to that end, and with that hope, I wish you all an enlightening and informative 2 days. Welcome again. Stay well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Provost Prezant. It's a real pleasure to have you join us and to have you initiate this symposium. The first panel of the symposium is, well, all 4 panels are, for me, tremendously exciting, but the first one I've been in particular looking forward to for the panelists and for the topic. The goal is to sort of set the stage for the rest of the symposium by having 4, I would say, eminent observers recount their experiences, what they've witnessed back during the war and in the times since then. All 4 have been absolutely dedicated to Bosnia and as Bosnians or otherwise. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. What I'll do is say a few words about each. I will introduce each in turn. They will have each some time to talk, and then there'll be some time for questions and answers afterwards. When we get to that point, the best way to submit a question is to click on the Q&A bubbles at the bottom of your Zoom meeting. I cannot, unfortunately, promise that we will get to all questions, but as moderator, I will do my best to get to as many as possible. Okay, without further ado, let me begin. First by introducing Janine DeGiovanni, a senior fellow at Yale's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, who is also directing a project sponsored by the UN Democracy Fund that promotes transitional justice in Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. She is a 2019 winner of the Guggenheim Fellowship for her research in the Middle East. And earlier this year, she received the American Academy of Arts and Lectures' highest prize for nonfiction, the Blake Dodd, for her body of work spanning 3 decades, a body of work that includes The Morning They Came for Us, Dispatches from Syria, which has been translated into 30 languages and deemed searing and necessary by the New York Times. The author of several books, including including The Vanishing, and I don't have it right here to show, but several books about from her time in Bosnia, both before the Dayton Accords and since then. Let me also then let me introduce, after Janine will come Peter Littman. Peter's a native of Seattle, Washington, and a lifelong human rights activist. He spent several years in pre-war Yugoslavia and post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina, and has visited Bosnia many times as well. He's closely followed the efforts of grassroots activists to return to their pre-war homes, to fight corruption and discrimination, and to regain their rights. His book on post-war human rights campaigns in Bosnia, Surviving the Peace, The Struggle for Post-War Recovery in Bosnia and Herzegovina, was published a year ago by Vanderbilt University Press. Then we will hear from Velma Saric and Chris Leslie. Velma is a researcher, journalist, peacebuilding expert, and human rights defender from Sarajevo. She's the founder and president of the Post-Conflict Research Center, an award-winning peacebuilding organization that I've had the the pleasure of working with, and I hope to continue to do so for many years. It works to cultivate an environment for sustainable peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Velma is also editor-in-chief of Balkan Discourse, an online platform for young activists and journalists that challenges stereotypes and shares diverse, independent views on society, culture, and politics in the region. Chris Leslie is a BAFTA Scotland New Talent Award-winning photographer and filmmaker, producing long-term multimedia documentary projects, including Disappearing Glasgow, which was first published in 2016, documenting his home city and the stories of the people who live there. His latest project, which will be launched later this year and early next year, is called A Balkan Journey, a visual arts project in the form of a book, website, and exhibition of a photographic journey through the towns and cities of post-conflict former Yugoslavia, using extensive and previously unseen footage from the archive over the past 25 years. So welcome all four of you. And we'll start with, let us start with a question for Janine, or if I can ask Janine to sort of set the table for us to describe what she saw as a journalist in Bosnia during the war, both from 1992 in Sarajevo, but also leading up to the point of the Dayton Accords, and perhaps if you could say a few words, Janine, about what you felt the expectations were at the end of the conflict, as the word came back from Dayton that there was a settlement and a brave new future to be forged.
Great, thank you, David, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, David Pettigrew and Provost and all the other panelists. It's an honor to be here to be talking about a subject that is so important to me personally, professionally, and really very much Bosnia is one of the most important threads in my life. And I want to go back to 1992 and take you back to that time and what it was like. But first, I have to say, I teach a course at Yale to my graduate students, a seminar called Four Conflicts Through a Human Rights Lens. I've been a war reporter for 30 years, so I've basically covered every violent conflict since the early 90s, including Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, East Timor, Somalia. Basically, every conflict you can think of, I've worked extensively on the ground as a field researcher and a human rights investigator. But nothing has touched me or broken my heart the way Bosnia did. And at the beginning of my class at Yale, in the four conflicts we look at, in the fall, we look at Bosnia, Rwanda, where I also was during the genocide, Sierra Leone, and Kosovo. And they're all linked by the theme of humanitarian intervention. And in the spring, I teach Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, which is linked by the theme of proxy war. And all of these conflicts, I've spent a huge amount of time on the ground. But when I start talking about Bosnia, and I lead up to what happened in Srebrenica in July 1995, I cannot get through the sentence without a huge lump in my throat. And this autumn, I actually started tearing up, which was mortifying for me in front of my students. But I cannot tell you how emotional that is for me. And I'm not a Bosnian, but I did live through the entire period leading up to Srebrenica, truly, truly believing that the world would step in, the international community would come to the aid of these people who were begging for help. But we did nothing until it was too late. And I am forever haunted by that as a member of the international community. I have never forgotten it. And more importantly, I teach now. I mean, I write quite often on Bosnia being a template for other conflicts and how we should recognize early warning triggers of what happened in Bosnia to prevent other wars from happening. Unfortunately, I began to see all of the early warning mechanisms in the United States leading up to the election. Not that we're going to go down the road of Bosnia, I truly believe we cannot, but the erosion of human rights, the suppression of the free press or the deriding of the free press, the rule of law being completely disregarded. All of these things are very worrying to me as someone who's watched war descend, and more importantly, how quickly it happens. So let me take you back to my first trip to Sarajevo, 1992. I had spent the summer and the autumn of 92 in central Bosnia, working with the refugees who were then pouring out of eastern Bosnia into places like Tuzla, Travnik, trying to seek shelter before the winter came. When I first drove into Sarajevo in those days, basically we didn't have, first of all, I'm not a journalist, like a television journalist who has armored cars and protection, and I'm alone. Maybe I could meet a photographer and we travel in together, but really I'm totally on my own without any means. And in those days, we had no cell phones. So really you were going in blind, and there was no phones, there was no electricity, and there was no water. What I saw, the devastated city of Sarajevo, were people living through the siege in a medieval way. So I saw people on the edge of Europe who were reduced to the most basic conditions. The sniping, the shelling was horrific. I don't think I've ever seen anything as bad as that, except for Chechnya. I was in Chechnya during the fall of Grozny to Russian forces, and that was the aerial bombardment was horrific. We didn't have aerial bombardment, but we had hundreds of mortar shells landing on the city every day. We had snipers. The minute we left our door, we knew that someone was watching us and that we'd be targeted. The food, if the humanitarian Airbus was working, people would get packages of rice, some oil, but it wasn't anything to sustain them. And remember, Bosnians love meat. But more importantly, aside from these things, the freezing cold, the lack of medical supplies, the heroic doctors working at Kosovo Hospital, operating sometimes with limited anesthetics and antibiotics, what really has stayed with me forever, and Velma knows this, is the spirit of the Bosnian people, who refused to be brought to their knees, even though the aim of the Bosnian Serbs was to destroy they didn't so much want to take Sarajevo, but they wanted to make it a symbol. We are going to crush a multicultural city in the middle of Europe, and we are going to bring you to our knees, your knees. So every day I'd wake up, and there was the Bosnian army, who I worked with very closely, told me to look at Mount Igman. And if there was a white flag hung from Mount Igman, that meant Sarajevo had fallen. And every day that I was there for those 3.5 years of the siege, 1992 to 1995, I got up and I looked out the window, and there was never the white flag. And even during the worst moments, and I would say the winter of 1993, and then the winter of 1994 were especially bad. The people just kept going. They kept going through it. Now, you asked about expectations. Very early on, we truly believed that Europe would not allow this to happen. But as time went on and the public grew weary, what we call compassion fatigue in the media business, of seeing pictures of injured children and starving people, they turned off, basically. The United States felt it was a European problem. The Europeans felt that the US should give a hand, but at any rate, nothing happened until 1995. In between that, people struggled to stay alive, and increasingly their spirits were getting battered down. But I remember going for a walk at one point across the river in the Egyptian battalion. The UNPROFOR who were there were divided up into various sectors. And the Egyptian battalion was on the other side of the river from where I was living at the Holiday Inn, which was on Sniper's Alley. And people had hung American flags. And I think Zlata Filipovic is on this call. And I think I was on my way to visit Zlata's family. So it must have been about 1994. Zlata was a young girl, I think she's 12 at the time, who was trying to grow up during the siege of Sarajevo. And I remember there were American flags hanging from windows. And I went and knocked on the doors and said to people, why are you doing this? And they said, because we're waiting for you to come save us. And that never happened. Now, when the lead up to Srebrenica was excruciating, and one of my strongest memories I have is climbing to the top floor of the presidency building. And, you know, it's kind of crazy the way journalists worked in those days. You could literally walk into the presidency and see a minister or see the vice president, Ayub Ganich, who was always, his view was, if you are brave enough to walk from the Holiday Inn to the presidency, then I have the obligation to talk to you. So we'd go into the freezing presidency and sit down, and he led me up to a radio station on top of the presidency where people were communicating directly with residents of Srebrenica. Now remember, Srebrenica was a safe haven, a UN declared safe haven. And I got up there and I could talk to people who were inside at the command post. And I will never forget someone saying to me, for the name of God, in the name of God, do something, do something. We are being overrun. We are without weapons. Remember, there was an arms embargo, a cruel arms embargo against the Bosnians, so they couldn't defend themselves. And I remember walking down the stairs, you know, the Bosnian War, I spent half of that war in tears, feeling so helpless. And I do remember one incident where I wrote a story about a young boy from Srebrenica who had been blinded. He went outside to play. He had been indoors for years, and his parents felt it was safe one moment, and he went inside to play and outside, and he was hit by shrapnel and he was blinded. And I wrote a very angry article about him. I was then working for the Sunday Times of London, which Margaret Thatcher saw. And in her usual way, she went on the floor of Parliament and belittled the inept politicians that were doing nothing. So she was one of the lone voices at that time, really calling out for humanitarian intervention. I think I'm probably running out of time, David, am I? So should I wrap up? I mean, how many more minutes do I have? Because I have much to say, but I want to give the others a chance as well.
It is fantastic, and I would love to hear you talk for the rest of the hour, but you're right, we do have other panelists.
Okay,
and
I'll wrap up.
Them, so please wrap up. That would be great.
Okay, I'll wrap up. I just want to point out one thing. So Dayton to me was an enormous disappointment for many reasons. Of course, it stopped the killing. And of course, Richard Holbrooke insisted that it was meant to be a temporary thing. But for me, and having lived through the atrocities of what happened in central Bosnia, in eastern Bosnia, the rape camps of Foča, the concentration camps of Amarska, the siege of Sarajevo, to see the perpetrators rewarded was heartbreaking. In 2000, and I'm finishing, after Milosevic was captured, I drove all night from Belgrade to Sarajevo to see my friends, to be with my friends, because I thought they'd be overjoyed that Slobodan Milosevic was on his way to The Hague. But they weren't. They didn't feel that in any way justice had been served. And now we're at 2020. And to me, you know, and for my Bosnian friends, I still feel that Dayton has not delivered anything near the justice that the Bosnian people deserve. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Janine. I think that was sobering, somehow both sobering and inspiring to hear, and it situates us exactly, I think, where we need to be. Peter, can you pick it up from there and talk about your perspectives of since the Dayton Accord?
Yes, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Good morning, everybody. And nice to be with you, colleagues and friends around the world. Can you hear me just fine?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. Well, as a human rights activist myself, I particularly focused on grassroots activism and campaigns for human rights towards recovery in the post-war period from 1997, when I returned to Bosnia after the war, up to today. And I should say that you may or may not know the extent of the destruction and the situation that confronted ordinary people after the war, which was, among other things, that some 500,000 housing units and houses were destroyed. Not 1 million, but over 2 million people were displaced and made refugees outside the country. That's over half the pre-war population of the country. And in the meantime, the population had been ethnically homogenized into 3 militarily divided and controlled territories. So people were faced with the necessity to return to their pre-war homes. And while they were trying to do that, they were also faced with fierce ethnic discrimination. And to the extent that return was possible, that being the primary central human rights campaign soon after the war, to that extent that they were able to return, they were still faced with discrimination, sometimes verging on apartheid. So that came to be a subsequent ongoing campaign against that discrimination and for equal rights in the places where people were now, unfortunately, newly minted minorities. In addition to that, people needed to wage a campaign for memorialization, to remember and to keep the memory alive of what had happened to them, what kind of victimization had been perpetrated during the war, an essential component of justice in an ongoing way. So people were and still are struggling for memorialization. And finally, another ongoing campaign that has to be seen as a human rights issue is the campaign against historical revisionism and atrocity denial, including genocide denial. So those were some of the obstacles, difficulties, and campaigns that people have undergone and participated in from the grassroots level since the end of the war and until today. Meanwhile, there was also the Dayton Agreement, which created, I would say, it enhanced the collective identity and politics of the country to the detriment of individual rights and citizen-based politics. In a strong way, it rewarded the people who had divided the country, prosecuted the war, and left them and their political heirs in position to further their wartime goals by other means. So this was and has continued to be another obstacle to recovery in Bosnia. Now, I have a strong memory of a conversation I had more than once with different people, ordinary people and friends in Bosnia after the war. Somebody said to me, the international community must work to change the mentality of those people who are dividing us and fomenting hatred. Well, in fact, the international community doesn't have to do that. It's probably not going to do that, and it hasn't done that. Only people can do that from below. People can, it's my opinion that the motor for change, for positive change and recovery comes from below. That's why I'm a grassroots activist myself. And I identify 3 centers of power in Bosnia, probably anywhere really, but in Bosnia, as I have discussed already, the grassroots level where people come up who innately know their rights, and there are people who become leaders because they have the intelligence and skill to unite their communities. That's one center of power. Secondly, there are the domestic officials who tend to work in the other direction because they are comfortable. They're able to pursue their corrupt goals by continuing to divide and separate people to quite an extent in harmony with the structure that has been set up by Dayton. And thirdly, there's the international community. When people ask, what does that mean? I'm just going to turn that around and say that in the present context, the relevant international community is composed of people representing those countries that care to deal with Bosnia in some way or another. So those are the three centers of power that I identify as relevant to the process of change or the obstruction of change in post-war Bosnia. To go on a little bit and discuss briefly, some of the campaigns that I observed closely in the entire period after the war. Well, two of them were very central early on were refugee return, as I've mentioned, and a parallel and overlapping campaign that has often been called the Campaign for Truth and Justice. Going to the refugee return activities, people organized local groups to return to their pre-war homes in specific locations, and those local organizations bonded together with regional coalitions, and there was at least one important national umbrella organization called the Coalition for Return, which coordinated information throughout the country and helped people understand what it was going to take for them to return home. So people who were organizing on a local basis, when they could manage to visit their pre-war homes, they would go and they would clean rubble in front of their devastated houses. They would harass and agitate in front of international agencies and demonstrate, sometimes block traffic, and generally make their presence known and their demands known also. Ultimately, after a few years, people were creating tent encampments in their pre-war communities or as close as they could get to them. They were faced with quite some obstruction, which I'll go into in a minute. But meanwhile, time doesn't really permit me to describe some of the valiant personalities who led these campaigns, but there was Vahid Kanlic from Gorazde, who helped people go back to Kopachi on the other side of the interentity borderline. There was the well-known Fadil Banjanovic from Zvornik, displaced to Tuzla, who also helped and agitated for multi-directional return. And it's important to note that women were a very prominent and integral, essential part of all these campaigns. In some ways, they had a superior ability to do organizing because they could travel more safely across former front lines, and they were involved in every return campaign. And there was also, as I mentioned, the Campaign for Truth and Justice, so much the more dominated by women activists, especially, say, from Srebrenica, where it was mostly composed of survivors and widows. And these people were demanding information about the location of mass graves, the exhumation and identification of their missing loved ones, and ultimately the creation of memorial cemeteries, such as the one at Potocari near Srebrenica. They were also demanding the arrest and prosecution of war criminals, and they worked and continued to work for more memorialization and against historical revisionism. So much less of the progress that happened since the war would have happened without the work of these women and these grassroots human rights activists. Moving on a little bit, I want to mention the obstruction that took place, obstruction to return. Certainly one of the first phenomena that existed was a kind of so-called low intensity terrorism, which of course is never low intensity if you are the object of it. There were bombings and arsons of rebuilt houses. There were assassinations. There was a lot of violence that made it feel like the war was really not over. However, an even more effective and long-lasting form of obstruction, which took place in three directions, was bureaucratic obstruction, say at the office counter, where people were confronted with a confounding array of applications that they had to fill out for return of their property, and they were slapped with exorbitant fees and requirements to present identification and penalties for having been gone from places where they had no choice but to leave. And utility hookup fees also. So this kind of bureaucratic obstruction went on and on, but people persisted, and to some extent, return did happen. Return actually happened to every one of the 143 municipalities in the country, although in some places it was minimal and barely even symbolic, and other places it reached perhaps a maximum of 50%, particularly around Zvornik, Doboj, the outskirts of Mostar, and certainly Prijedor. Now, the international community, what did they do? What happened? What was their response? Well, in the first 5 years, the international community contributed at least $5 billion to reconstruction and recovery. That was at a time when $5 billion was actually still real money. It also promoted elections, which are still have been happening every 2 years. But I would say that the confusion between electoralism and democracy is one that has certainly been present in Bosnia, because elections did not create democracy. There is still the cronyism and clientelism that existed from the beginning. I do want to mention a couple positivci. Now that's an expression referring to people who understand that they themselves can create better conditions, that they can continue to work, and that they don't recognize the possibility of failure. The names of leaders I mentioned earlier, those are such people, and there have been a few among the careerists of the international community, at least in certain incidents. Well, Ambassador from the US, Thomas Miller, went to Srebrenica in 2001 on his birthday, rolled up his sleeves and helped clear out rubble from devastated houses. That was a good move. And somewhat later, when I was observing elections in Srebrenica in 2012, I met a bright young man who informed me he was from the British Embassy, modestly. Later, I realized he was Ambassador Nigel Casey. So you could ask, it brings me to the question, could the international community change its mentality? And I would say no. The only way that the international community can be compelled to help change take place where it needs to take place and where it can take place is for officials to pay attention to the grassroots, a really very underobserved and underappreciated force for change. It looks like I'm running out of time, and I will simply finish by saying that the impulse for justice never goes away, although activists come and go. Activism continues in waves, and I'm hoping that in the near future, officials of the international community will see clear to provide better support to those grassroots activists.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I think that that's so important to keep right in front of us. And as we talk about Bosnia, particularly for those of us on this side of the pond, you know, it can seem like an abstract notion, and it's very easy with an abstract notion to forget about grassroots activism. But yes, I completely agree that change has to begin on the ground and cannot be done without recognition and initiation on the ground. And so I suppose it's fitting that I next introduce, give the floor over to Velma, whose whole career I think probably fits within that description. Also, Velma and Chris, you were sort of, you've presented yourself as a package deal. So I'll let the two of you work out how you will divide up your presentation. Velma, if you want to speak first, that's fine. If you're a little bit more integrated than that, that's fine as well.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much, first of all, to all of you organizing this panel and for the invitation. Yes, me and Chris, we are in a package. Our deal is that I will start it first, but he would like to share his screen with the recent project we mentioned, Balkan Journey, which is multimedia project. So Chris, if you want to do that before I start. It's a great to see you all, first of all. I know that this is intensive period in the United States, so thank you so much for coming and organizing this panel for us and speaking about Bosnia. So I'm going to start it with mentioning a little bit about my background, which David already presented kind of about Post-Conflict Research Center and what we do and how we are based on peace building and how basically we are trying to cultivate an environment where sustainable peace in Bosnia and Greater Balkans region would be possible. So my background goes into journalism. I spent over 10 years in a trial court reporting from the Hague Tribunal, where I wrote probably more than 300 reports about the war proceedings of high-profile war criminals like Ratko Karadzic and Radovan Mladic. I also did court reporting for Balkan Investigating Reporting Network and several other reporting agencies. Alongside this, I work as a genocide researcher for Institute for Research Crime Against Humanity and International Law at Sarajevo University for 5 years. And 10 years ago, I established Post-Conflict Research Center. So what we are trying to do, Peter just mentioned this grassroots activism and necessity for going on a grassroots level and working in a field of youth education especially. And we do have this ambitious goal of working in a field of reconciliation, which is quite difficult in Bosnia and in the Balkans. So our organization have a kind of different approach than usual non-governmental organizations. We have been literally designing and implementing innovative peace building initiatives and programs for youth and communities once divided by war. It's quite different because we are also taking global approach and present stories from all around the world. So far, our projects have been presenting stories, examples from the Holocaust, for example, Rwanda, Cambodia, Colombia, Northern Ireland, Vietnam, Nepal. Our innovation is different because we are using cutting-edge multimedia materials and tools and platforms. So David, you mentioned Balkan Discourse, which is our pan-ethnic youth platform where we are educating young people in the basic journalistic techniques and how to use photography. So Chris will show, for example, our photo work we did together. And then universality. So through these, with this unique and global and open approach, our projects, they have been seen all around the world. And they have been replicated also in the region of Western Balkans. So I'm going to mention the core pillars in which we work, and then I'm going to move more closer toward our topic because I don't want to talk about the work of Post-Conflict Research Center. That is not our main goal here. But we do work in the field of genocide prevention, preventing violent extremism and sexual violence in conflict. This work is work which we did together with Professor Simon and Yale University, where we were working closely with United Nations Office of Special Advisor for Genocide Prevention and Mass Atrocities. And we were trying to educate the civil societies in the region of Western Balkans in the basic mechanisms, early warning mechanisms of genocide prevention and mass atrocities. The second pillar is transitional justice. So in a pillar of transitional justice, we are here focused on historical dialogue, historical remembrance, historical analysis, and truth seekings. I'm going to mention probably the most important initiative we did recently while we were organizing together with Srebrenica Genocide Memorial 25th commemoration of Srebrenica genocide. And we were using our third pillar, which is multimedia and art. Literally, we brought this nomadic monument, Why You Are Not Here, or Što te nema, by our famous diaspora artist Aida Šehović, symbolizing the cups of coffees, which literally were presenting missing people from Srebrenica. So this is the work in the field of transitional justice. I'm not going to stay too long. Creative multimedia and arts. We mentioned how we are educating young people in basic citizenship journalistic skills. And post-conflict research goes mostly in a partnership with different universities and institutions. I'm going to mention the role of reconciliation, the role of art in reconciliation are research projects which we ran with the King's College and London School of Economy in the last 4 years. So I will stop here. I'm not going to talk more about Post-Conflict Research Center. I would like to mention that we are working in an environment where we are still struggling with, for example, pure phenomenon of segregations. We have still this phenomenon of 2 schools under one roof, where young people are literally divided and they go in the same school, but they are like physically separated and they don't interact between each other. Our process of educating young people is still going through non-formal way. We are not able to go into a classroom. We are not able to approach young people normally, which is a large problem. We work in divisive pre-war and nationalistic atmosphere. We have a governmental structure which lacks accountability. We have a large level of corruption and nepotism. We have bias and misinformed media. Of course, poor economy, which is resulting that the most talented people are leaving, young people are leaving the country. So it's all these I do see as a large, of course, consequences of war, but still complicated structure in a country where you have 186 ministries, but you don't have a state ministry for education and youth, where you don't have a clear strategy where actually and how you want to, teach young people about recent history in war. Where you still have a triumphalism of war, not just denial. Denial is, of course, a large problem, denial of genocide in the recent past, but there is a new phenomenon of triumphalism and celebrating war criminals and, giving them a lot of space in a lot of public space. A recent example for that is a student dormitory with the name Radovan Karadžić at Pale, for example. With a dire need in the region to recognize the victims of conflict on all sides and establish the truth about the conflict. The critical component of reconciliation and peace building process is far away from being achieved. A lot of things has to be done on all levels to counter denial and crimes and all these human rights violations. I'm not even going into minority problems like Roma, and this would take so much time. And what I would like to say is that I want to be a little bit positive, and I want to say that despite all these problems and challenges, we have to be aware that there is a peace. We do have a peace. Janine mentioned how horrible and difficult was in war, and I went through war by myself, so I do know how important peace is and how much we have to work to cherish peace and educate young people about necessity to preserve and work toward peace and peace building. So I'm going to mention that our approach is kind of grassroots, which Peter just was talking about, and that grassroots initiatives continue to have important role in fostering and cultivating the role of memory and reconciliation. I think that because I'm coming from civil society, non-governmental sector, I'm going to talk about our work and what we should do and what can be kind of like a solution for let's not use the word reconciliation, but let's say moving forward, because for reconciliation, we still didn't accomplish all these important pillars like reparations, impunity for perpetrators, and all these problems we are struggling with. But there is a hope if civil societies, organizations, and NGO create strong networks among each other. If they do share information and research, for example, if they avoid duplication, if they facilitate the idea of speaking with one voice, if they, I would say, work better on outreach and informing ordinary citizens about what should be done or what is done already. I do believe that there is a lot of good examples which we can use from Council of Europe, for example, their standards and recommendations on multi-perspective history teaching, researching, and learning. So that can be something what, for example, we can on some level replicate and use for our future. Idea of creating the curriculum about the recent past. We can work more on the grassroots level, which Peter mentioned. This is because we have been divided. I mentioned how Dayton created 186 ministries and 10 cantons and 2 entities, but we do also have municipality level. So grassroots organizations, they can move on municipality level. I know that Post-Conflict Research Center had a chance to work with some municipality mayors and bring our peace building projects in their communities. We should take a look at the role of the religious leaders, for example. We should create our own media and our own platforms, and we should push more. So I'm urging on civil society and non-governmental sector to speak with one voice. And I don't know how much time I have. I will stop here because I'm probably running, and I want Chris to present what we did with the Balkan journey. So.
But that's great, Velma. But a good idea to turn it over to Chris, mindful of the time for the entire panel, and hopefully to address questions towards the end. Thank you, Velma.
Hi everyone. Good afternoon from Glasgow, Scotland. I'm going to just quickly talk you through this Balkan Journey project, and if technology works with us, I should be able to show a PDF. Just give me a wee second. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, is that okay? This is just a snippet of the project. I'm aware of, conscious of time, and we've had a lot of good speakers beforehand, and there'll be a lot of questions. So this project is a project, a visual arts project that I worked alongside PCRC with Velma, and it was funded by Creative Scotland. And it's a visual arts project in the form of an exhibition, book, and photography and essays. And we have a number of events planned in Scotland and in Croatia and Bosnia, 2021 now because of COVID. I take the kind of journey on a viewer across post-conflict former Yugoslavia. So I arrived in just after the war, and I arrived in Croatia first of all. This project, I work alongside a writer called John McDougall in Glasgow here, and as well as it being a book and an exhibition, we have a website platform called Balkan Journey, and we would like to use this as a kind of journal, a platform to talk about all these things that have been spoken about just now, particularly around 25 years after the war. So it's an invitation for anyone to kind of get involved. The book and the website are bilingual as well, because again, it's really important that you know, this is a Bosnian and Croatian audience as well there. So I was really keen to make sure we had that. Anyway, so this is a snippet of the project in the book, and I'm going to focus partly on the people who I've met and photographed talking about Dayton and 25 years on, and how that is for people in the region. So like most people, I witnessed the wars in former Yugoslavia from a safe distance in television. Like most people in Western Europe, I tuned in, watched in horror, scratched my head, then tuned out. I was living in a small town in Scotland. I was in my late teens, and the wars in the former Yugoslavia were happening in a distant parallel universe. And that suited the powers that be not to intervene. I think we were told, this is a crazy war, stay out of it. These people have been wanting to tear each other apart for years. It's too complicated, etc. But in 1995, 96, I was a psychology undergraduate, and for my final year thesis, I wrote a paper on the former Yugoslavia, trying to get some kind of answers for myself and explanations as to what and why was happening. And through all that reading and that research, I eventually became obsessed by everything and anything to do with the Balkans. And I began to kind of then look into volunteer opportunities within the region. So I ended up in this small town here called Pakrac. and Pakrac was in western Slavonia in Croatia. The town itself was in ruins, 85% destroyed during the war. Tension divisions still running high, and not much had been kind of rebuilt. There was a former front line that ran through the town that was now the dividing line, which few people crossed. Most of the Serbs had left. The only Serb population that was left were elderly Serb ladies. I then stayed within this project and lived in this town for the next kind of 4 months, and that had a massive kind of impact on my outlook and everything else. The project was called Volunteer Project Pakrac, and it had been set up in 1993 as a grassroots civilian peace building project. Much of the work involved rebuilding homes, assistance in small agricultural projects, community visits, and educational projects for children. And it was through these community visit projects and all the other work that I started to kind of really be frontline and meet all these people who I had read about and watched on television. One of the old ladies, Luba Gajic, 80-year-old Serb woman who lived alone in a tiny, partially destroyed house. She had this kind of classic Balkan old lady look. She had a headscarf, impressive vocabulary of swear words as well, which always is always a good connection if you're from Glasgow when you meet somebody who swears more than you. This lady was just fantastic, and the whole experience of Pakrac and that connection with the people kind of set me off on this journey. So within the last 4 months I was there in Pakrac, the project started to fall apart. There was no money to pay or rent the volunteers' house, and these were to be the last days of the project. So I spent most of my remaining time in Pakrac with Luba, chopping wood for her. I don't know much Serbo-Croat. Bosnian and Croatia, I know Serbo-Croat doesn't exist as a language anymore, but I had a small phrase book to kind of... But this idea of language and the barriers it can create didn't seem to create any barriers in the Balkans. Spent a lot of fun time with Luba and a lot of fun time with a lot of people in that region. And this was like a parallel universe that I was now very much part of, and I just was really that time in Pakrac was kind of, I think like Janine was saying earlier, it just gets you hooked, and the people and everything about it. So my days in Pakrac came to an end in November 1996, but my Balkan journey had truly begun. So the following year in 1987, I ended up volunteering in Sarajevo. Spurred on from the Pakrac project, I set up my own photo project for children, the Sarajevo Camera Kids. And using donated equipment from Scotland, I set up a makeshift darkroom and organised photo classes in the basement of the city's main orphanage. I volunteered on this project for 3 consecutive summers. This is all I did, and all I wanted to do was to run this project. So my students ran freely around their playgrounds and streets and photographed anything and everything that interested them, their playgrounds, their friends, their favourite hangouts, all against the backdrop of Sarajevo, which was completely still destroyed, a few years after the war. So it was a fairly unique project. And over the next kind of 20 years after this project, and once I started becoming a photographer myself, because I wasn't a photographer during all this time really, I would return to the Sarajevo many times over the kind of next 20 years, and started to kind of document the changes, and not within the city, Sarajevo itself, but within Bosnia as well. The kind of biggest project I'd done a photo essay for The Guardian, and it was around the 20-year anniversary, this time 5 years ago, of Dayton. And I envisioned, romanticised, there would be this huge, celebrations in the street or events and things going on. And I think, like Janine was saying earlier on, that there was no, it was quite hard to kind of celebrate any kind of events afterwards, because things were still so traumatic for a lot of people. Anyway, so this kind of focus of the project in this point is I wanted to speak to a lot of young people who were in their late teens and early 20s, who were born during or just after the conflict and had no memory of war. Because everyone, people my age and friends my age in the city, everyone who lived through Sarajevo had a story to tell, etc. But these young people had no memory of war, and they were being made to carry this baggage of the war. It was never their war, and they just wanted to move on. And the guy on the right, Kemir, was a young guy who I photographed, and what he quoted to me was, he said, a lot of people in Bosnia are considering peace as something unusual and special, and that way accepting every kind of injustice from the government. The government, through the media, makes sure that people get reminded of the war on a daily basis, in this way achieving that people continue to register peace as something unusual and special to Bosnia. I also went to Pali for the first time as well, because I wanted to get a mixed kind of response from lots of young people from all backgrounds. And I met with a young girl, Dorothea. She was 22 and from Pali. And Dorothea argued strongly that if peace was to work and there was to be reconciliation, there had to be an end to the kind of blaming and generalisation. She told me Serbs are all labelled as terrorists and warriors, even today. Of course, there were bad Serbians, but there were bad Muslims and there were bad Croats living in this war too. We can never move forward if we're still being labelled. And I think because she was part of this generation that was born afterwards, it wasn't her war. You know, that's a very provocative statement to make to anyone who lived through the war. But for younger people of that age, it's very important that they get the chance to kind of move on and to make Bosnia a success. This also just, it was not just people born after the war who were dispossessed and fighting back. In Baraj in central Bosnia, neighbours who were once fighting in the front line against each other were now joining forces to work together. I met a couple, Mirnes and his wife, Janana, who'd set up an organic goat farm. And Mirnes was a young soldier when the Dayton Agreement ended the war, and he was not a huge advocate of the agreement at all, but stressed at that time it was important just to stop the war. To stop the war was a major achievement. But what he said is that politicians have taken advantage of the many holes in Dayton and they still want to live in the past. But he saw a future in working together and cooperating. So with the assistance of an NGO called Help Bosnia, Mirnes and his wife are working with their former enemy and neighbour Bosnian Serb Bozo, and he was going to turn his accommodation into this part of this small eco-village resort. So they have the organic farm, Bozo provides the accommodation, and they work together and they were going to create this model. Speaking to Bozo, you know, his first line was, the best thing about Dayton was that I could finally throw away my gun. You know, there was this idea people just didn't want it anymore and they were very, very happy to get rid of their guns. He would say to me, today I no longer watch TV, the politicians want us to be at war, but it's the man on the ground that always suffers. War is in the past and our future is working together. It's the only way our village will survive. Just very quickly moving on, and I'm coming to an end now. I have no idea where I am time-wise, but I'm nearly there. So this Sarajevo Camera Kids project, I returned in the summer of 2018 to be reunited with some of these kids who I taught photography to 20 years later. And although many of them had remained in the city, they had mixed views about living there. Some wanted to stay on in Bosnia and bring up their own children there. Others, hamstrung by politics, corruption, and the poor economy, wanted to escape. This is Janita Katovic, who was one of the students, and this is 1998. She was 30 at the time, and this was Janita 20 so years on. She's now married with a child and works as a primary school teacher. And when I spoke to Janita about everything that's happened in the past 20 years and our future in the city and in Bosnia itself, she said to me, I was born here and I survived the war and I love it here. I've got used to the rhythm of life in Sarajevo, but one thing's for sure, if there's ever a hint of conflict returning, she would go, she would leave without a doubt with her family. But what was important is that connection she had with the city. All Sarajevans, anyone who survived that siege and survived Sarajevo has a real connection with the city. And that's very, very hard to find in other cities, unique to the kind of tragic events that were on in the city, but this is a real positive, that there is such a love for the city. Other students who I managed to track down had slightly different stories. This was Nusrat pictured here in Sarajevo in 1997. And Nusrat had lost both his parents during the war and ended up in the orphanage, Bijalovi orphanage, where I was running this project. And this orphanage took in children from across Bosnia. It was one of the main functioning orphanages during the war. And years later, I met up with Nusrat again, 2018. Nusrat then had moved on. He had settled down and had a child, and that his own baby was actually taken from him by the authorities. He was deemed to be at risk in the relationship he was in, and his child was placed in the very same orphanage that he was placed in and had grown up. Unfortunately, in 2005, tragically, a fire swept through the building, killing Nusrat's son and 5 other babies. He ended up distraught, destitute, addicted to drugs, living in all these ruined houses around the city, completely lost. He took me to the abandoned building where he used to live and explained now how his life had turned a corner. He was now clean of drugs. A local mosque was providing him with support and giving him a place to stay and paying his monthly rent. He was off the drink and he was off the drugs. He was clutched his prayer beads really tightly and told me he'd finally found home. But Nusrat spoke about all these other things, about institutionalization of children and all these other bigger pictures of issues going on in Bosnia. And just to kind of finally end, Edina was joined the project in 1997, and this is pictured in 1998. Now, Edina took over the project from me. I trained Edina up with the idea of handing this photo project over because I wanted her to work with the younger children. And she ran that project for 12 months. Teaching and working with the younger kids in the orphanage. Tragically, in 2018, Edina and her 1-year-old son and her mother were killed in a tragic accident when a car crashed off on a notorious stretch of road on the river en route to Mostar. Everyone who I spoke to had different paths, in life. But I remember speaking to Edina and I interviewed her, and the last time I saw her was 2011. And I thought this would be a fitting quote to end this short presentation about Balkan Journey. So she said to me, "Bosnia will survive as a country and Sarajevo will continue as a multicultural city open to all. But we have so much work to do and there are still many divisions. But there is a new generation of young people born after the war who aren't obsessed by it. And we owe it to them to make it work." So that's just a snippet of Balkan Journey. There's a lot more in it. If you go to balkanjourney.com, all the stories and the journal and the essays and the photographs are all there. And please get in touch if you would like to contribute to the journal. There's a big social media campaign. I'm working alongside Velma with PCRC to just get a number of stories and things about Bosnia 25 years on out to a wider audience. And this is what I'm hoping I can do with this project. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I, for one, am certainly, these are incredibly moving stories and images. And I, for one, am very much looking forward to the full release of Balkan Journeys. And I think there's a lot to be said there. So we have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. I think all 4 of our panelists have brought a lot to the table and left a lot of open threads to follow up on. There have already been a couple of questions posted to the Q&A function on Zoom here, and I encourage other attendees to do the same. I will turn there first, and then look for other questions elsewhere. But the easiest place to get your question heard and relayed to the panelists is to post it there. A quick question from Robert McNeil: wasn't Dayton only supposed to be an interim solution that should be in place for about 6 months? And Janine, I'll just quickly answer this because Janine has, and I'll quote her since that's what Holbrook said, but it was never amended. And indeed, I believe it felt like Dayton had the terms of the Dayton Accords had that sort of permanent temporary feel. Like it was always meant to be temporary, but the exact termination of it was never ever defined. And so There was never any long run there. But let me turn to the question, and feel free to jump in, anyone, to expand on that. But let me also turn to the question asked by Claudia Zinni. Question asked for Janine, but I think actually it applies equally to, from the different perspectives, all four panelists. What, in your opinion, would it take for Bosnian people to feel that justice has been delivered and to heal the pain? Is it possible to heal that heartbreaking feeling after all? Janine, I'll let you, since I was directed to you, why don't you take the first crack at that? But I invite Velma and Peter and Chris, to address that as well.
Hi, thank you. I just want to quickly say something too. Chris's photos, in it, there was a young boy called Nusrat, and I was really shocked to see him on the screen because during the war, I think it was the winter of 1993, Nusrat was my guide to wartime Sarajevo. I think he was about 9 years old when I met him. He was almost like a feral animal. He had lost both his parents. I found him in the orphanage, and we used to go on these daily journeys through wartime apocalyptic Sarajevo. And indeed, Velma worked with me very closely in the aftermath of the war to find him again. It was one of the most tragic stories. And I wrote about it in Granta. I can post the link to the article if any of you want to find it. It's called The Book of the Dead, and it's followed by a short piece called Finding Nusrat. Anyway, in response to the question, how do we heal? Well, if you look at post-conflict countries that have managed to have a better rate of healing, Rwanda, for instance, I think that it is really a question of addressing it. And I think the memorials are very important, but I also think justice is important. And when I go back to Bosnia over and over again, and I largely work with victims of sexual violence, they still stay in their villages, and the men who rape them, sometimes up to 16 times a day, are walking around the villages. So I think one of the things The Hague did was it tried to reach the big fish, right? Milosevic, Karadzic, Plavnic, whoever the leaders were. But really what was important, and what we often forget, that Bosnia was very much a backyard war, meaning neighbors turned on neighbors. Within Sarajevo itself, street versus street, there was hand-to-hand fighting in some parts of the city. So for people to feel in any way that there is justice, they have to see that there has been some kind of efforts to bring the rapists, the ethnic cleansers, the murderers, the prison wardens, to bring them to bring their crimes to light. And I think there was very little of this in Bosnia. That combined with what I often found was that people, once the war ended, didn't want to talk about it. It was almost as though 1995 came, money flooded into the city, into the country for rebuilding. But people wanted to move on. I know I have a Bosnian godson. We baptized him in 1992 at the height of the bombing. And he says now, I don't want to know about that country. I want to move forward with my life. So I think we need to look at, first of all, what happened there and never forget those terrible years. And second, bring the people in the villages, in the cities who really actively contributed to the atrocities to justice.
Thank you, Janine. Velma or Peter, or Chris, anything you want to add about this question of where does healing come from? Where can there be is there a space for healing?
I think if I could say having a platform to discuss what happened and discuss the conflict is important, and that's why organisations and projects like PCRC are important. But I think there's almost, to me, it's almost like a waiting game as well, in terms of these young people are waiting for this generation, this elder generation, and these elder politicians still in, peddling the same corruption, etc., to kind of move on and to die, to put it bluntly, and to stop passing down the baton of kind of extreme nationalism and all this to the younger generation. It's not so much a healing thing. It's just there has to be a breakage in passing all this stuff down, and these people will pass on. But it's not passing. They have to stop this legacy of hatred and nationalism and division being passed down. But it's getting there. Time is moving on, and that's one of the things I think will be key.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. You've turned your mic off. I hope
Yes.
that you're
Okay, can you hear me now? Yes. What Janine said about justice is, of course, essential, and I will counter that. Unfortunately, there will be not much progress toward justice as long as the Dayton structure keeps the wartime leaders and their political heirs in power, because they are continuing to divide people. And so everybody wants justice. Everybody wants absolute justice, which will not happen. And I would just propose that, among everything else, something that will give people hope and distract them from their frustration, take away some of the frustration, is to work to create an economy that works so people aren't giving up and leaving. It's not only the lack of jobs that make people want to leave, it's that they're fed up with the political situation. But if they have something to do where they can make a decent living, and people are, for the most part, well educated, many people, but 200,000 people have left approximately in just the last 5 years. If they have something to do, it's going to help really a lot with their peace of mind.
Thank you, Peter, and that's great because it also addresses the question that Alex McLean posted to the chat about young people. Velma, though, you looked like you wanted to chime in for a second as well.
Yes, I just want to jump in with adding that for us, especially for young people, the joining EU, European Union, is actually like something what should be or what can be a motivator. Peter just mentioned the lack of jobs and economy, and Janine is completely right. If you take a look at small municipalities where perpetrators or victims are living side by side, it's much more easier to speak from the perspective of Sarajevo, Banja Luka, and Mostar, which usually are centers of powers, but small communities economically, and with the fact that they are still living in this hostile environment of war, are completely different side. But what should be our goal, and civil society and NGOs should promote, is European future and trying to build up European identity among young people, because if you take a look, we are still struggling a lot here with national and ethnic identities. Young people are quite confused with this. So only hope of joining and promote the EU values and make our governments aware that should be our only, and Euro-Atlantic perspective, it's our only perspective related to youth. So I will stop here.
Okay, good. Thank you. Questions are starting to come in fast and furiously now, which is, of course, always happens when you have just 10 minutes left to address them all. So we're gonna try to do a sort of a lightning round. But before we do that, I just want to remind you that this is just the first panel of 4, and as well as 2 keynotes. There will be a second panel at 1:30 Eastern US time today at the same Zoom address, focusing on transitional justice, in fact. And then our first keynote will be at 3:30 with Hariz Halilovic, 3:30 Eastern US time, addressing Quo Vadis Bosnia, but in some sense the very theme of this conference. I'm going to group a couple questions together and just put them out there for the entire panel. Rachel and Asmir have both sort of expressed what I don't know if the right word is anomie, but a slight, maybe perhaps an alienation or frustration with the institutions and the prospects for change. Rachel says, it feels like voting in elections on any level does nothing for these situations. What steps do outsiders like me can they take to begin to shift the tide? And Asmir asks, why is the only solution the status quo and supporting more and more of the same extreme right politics? How do we, how does the narrative change on either the political and the personal fronts? How do you address the feeling of powerlessness that that many students in whether in Bosnia or America are expressing? Anyone want to? Yeah, Peter, please.
Sure. Well, for me, it just really goes back to the centers of power that I discussed earlier, and change can happen from the point of people, from the position of people who can visualize it from below, because they are the ones who are affected by the stagnation that is taking place, and by the structural blockages that prevent change from happening. People have to organize. They have to organize better. There was nearly a rebellion in 2014. It was not received very well by the international community who did not, for the most part, understand very well what was going on. It needed to organize people. People need to dig in to the grassroots, into their communities, and unite them. Some of this is happening. You've seen people work across inter-entity borders, across ethnic boundaries in the case of street violence in recent years. And it's the only solution, because there is something that some people call a stableocracy. In other words, the stability, the absence of war, which does not connote peace, is good enough for the international community. They have people they can do business with, whether they're former war criminals or not. So they're not really, from the international direction, working to change the structure that keeps Bosnia stagnant. People from below have to do that, and then it will happen when international officials understand that they have to support those people.
Can I add something to that? Thank you, Peter. And what I think is, first of all, we have to acknowledge the frustration that people feel with the stagnation of the political process. I mean, we're seeing it right now in America, and change often does take a long time to occur. But my response to Rachel, the two students and the intern that wrote in and said, what could we do? I think, what I've always done in my work in both war zones and post-conflict situations is you focus very much on the micro. You can't change the enormity of a situation, but you can work on very specific issues and break them down. And the other thing is that as a writer, what I always found was if you tell the story of one person, for instance, Nusrat for me became a way of expressing and explaining what happened exactly in Sarajevo, the horror of it, and the aftermath, how a young person fell through the cracks of society completely, how we failed him, the international community, twice, once during the war and once during the reconstruction of Bosnia, because there were no services available to him. I also want to there's a really good question, and I think it links in with this. Asma Rahimmeyer asked about how do we move from grieving to healing? And again, I think this is such a great question. Thank you, Asma. If I'm going to use my experience in other post-conflict countries, Sierra Leone, which went through one of the most brutal wars I've ever witnessed in terms of attacks on civilians. You might remember that the rebels amputated civilians at the wrist and at the elbow just to make them living grotesque reminders of the power that they had. So today, Sierra Leone functions, it's not perfect, but like Rwanda, there are obviously many things that could be different, but they have managed to come to a place of acknowledging what happened and then healing. And I think in any kind of situation, grieving, of course, takes years and years. And every time I go back to the Srebrenica memorials on July 9th to 12th, I'm always struck by how the pain is never, it doesn't lessen. It was like that in 2000, 2005, 2010, 2015. So we're never going to move away from how much pain happened in Bosnia, but I think there will be a time with another generation perhaps that can absorb it and begin to move forward by remembering it. And also by storytelling has huge power. To be able to tell people's stories so that they're never forgotten. And also, so we don't repeat the mistakes again. When I began to report the war in Syria, all I could see was a repeat of Bosnia. It seemed as though, you know, those who refuse to acknowledge the past are doomed to repeat it. So thank you for asking that question.
Thank you, Janine. There are a couple more questions out there. We're within a couple minutes of having to end, and unfortunately, this is the one session where we just can't extend the discussion beyond 1:30. There is one question that I will relay from the Q&A is a question about human rights activism, which is, I think, a step beyond this question of, you know, what can you do with the frustration at anomie? It's how do you get involved? How and what are the barriers that confronting human rights activists and enabling those human rights activists to overcome those barriers? So I'm thinking Velma and Peter, this one seems to be particularly for you.
I mean, I can go first. Well, Janine just beautifully, she just mentioned this micro level, which I think is or grassroots level, which Peter was talking about. And that is exactly what we do through the work of Post-Conflict Research Center. That is what we do also through storytelling. As Janine mentioned, we are trying to work with the situation we have, not complaining and not to criticizing too much the Dayton or, you know, finding excuses in a complicated political system. We are trying to find and overcome the bridges by bringing young people together, creating these multimedia educational approach where we will be able to reach them through these new technologies like social media or video games or these new channels. For us, you know, this battle will never end because we are aware that we have a complicated system, but we are also aware that, you know, we cannot waste our time by just complaining on the politics and the politician and the nationalism and all these problems we have. We need to go on the grassroots level and we need to work, we need to record, we need to preserve. As Janine beautifully summarize, you know, if we don't, you know, remember the history, we are doomed to repeat it. So that is like literally the only advice I have: networking, working together, creating a civil society, strong civil society network. So Peter, I'm taking all time, sorry.
No, it's fine. I would actually prefer to let you have the last word, but I will just quickly say that one way people can help is to support grassroots organizations and organizations that are really making a difference, including, of course, Velma's organization. Also, the Center for Nonviolent Action gets people together, including veterans, people from different ethnicities. And anybody who is working to promote memorialization, certainly in Prijedor is an outstanding example of that. You're going to have to look into that. Many of us have written something about these different things. And pay attention to the ongoing historical revisionism and distortion of what went on, because I have to continue to assert that fighting that distortion and dishonesty is an integral part of the of any human rights campaign. So there's plenty of good work to be supported.
Peter, I just want to say
Yes.
thank you so much for bringing up the disinformation, because of course we had the incident of Peter Handke getting the Nobel Prize. We had Jill Stern writing a love letter to Radovan Karadzic in a form of a book called My War Criminal. So we've also, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's a whole topic we haven't even discussed, of this revisionist theories of what happened during the war. And you know, I lived through it. I saw it. Did I make that up? Did my colleagues make that up? We were there. So to see people like Jill Stern and Handke being rewarded in a sense for denying that Srebrenica happened, or denying the figures, is just so appalling for the survivors and for all the Bosnian people, for the pain that they have gone through. So thank you, Peter, for bringing that up. It's a really important point.
All I can say now is that I am just disappointed that we have to cut off this conversation, because it's so wonderful to hear from all four of you. I really appreciate each and all of your words and perspectives, and I think it's been a enlightening way to start off this this symposium. As a matter of fact, the next panel that I've already mentioned begins in 2 hours at 1:30 p.m. Eastern U.S. time. There will be two discussions or two presentations, or well, maybe one presentation now, addressing denial. And so maybe that might be something that we can continue discussing later on this afternoon. But again, on behalf of David Pettigrew and Southern and from the Genocide Studies program here at Yale, I wish to thank all four of you, and I hope to work with all of you again soon, and I hope that the participants, the attendees, will come back for more later today and again tomorrow. So thank you all very much.